Some cases never end with an answer. They end with a question that stays open for decades. Today, we're telling you one of those stories, not as a mystery to solve, but as a warning, written by the person living it, that no one heard clearly enough, soon enough. In June 2008, a 27-year-old woman sat in an office in West Valley City, Utah, and wrote a will. Not the kind that divides up property, just one line, handwritten, locked away in a safe deposit box at her bank. All except Josh Powell. I don't trust him. That woman was Susan Cox Powell. Josh Powell was her husband, the man who, at the time, was still sleeping next to her every night, still raising her 2 young sons with her. She didn't write that line after a fight. She didn't write it in a moment of impulse. She put it away carefully, like someone preparing for something she hoped would never happen. More than a year earlier, she even recorded a short video of herself alone, just to say, if something happens to me, here's what people need to know. 18 months later, Susan Powell vanished without a trace. Police would find that line. They'd find an entire diary hidden somewhere her husband couldn't reach it, tracking her fear year after year. But by the time anyone read it, everything Susan had feared was already happening, and there was no way to undo it. It's rare, in a case like this, for the person at the center of it to leave behind this much of her own voice. Most of what we know about victims in cases like these comes secondhand, through police reports, through recollections of people who know them. Susan left her own record. 15 years is a long time for a case to stay open. Long enough for detectives who worked in the file in 2009 to retire. Long enough for an entire generation of true crime coverage to come and go, revisiting the same unanswered question again and again. This isn't a story about who killed Susan Powell, even though that question still has no answer more than 15 years later. This is the story of a woman who saw what was coming, who tried to leave a warning in her own hand, in her own voice, and about the distance, sometimes just a few days, sometimes just a locked door, between a warning written down and a warning heard in time. Before we go any further, it's worth sitting with that distance for a moment. Because this isn't a story that ends with a tidy resolution. It's a story that asks something harder of its audience, to hold 2 things at once. A woman who saw danger coming clearly enough to document it, and a world around her that, again and again, couldn't act on what she'd already written down. Before she was a name in a case file, Susan Cox Powell was a real person, living a real life. She was born in New Mexico, spent time in Alaska, and grew up partly in Washington State before her family settled down and she met Josh Powell. The two married in 2001, when Susan was just 19. She worked as a broker at Wells Fargo Financial, a job that demanded precision, punctuality, reliability. Co-workers later remembered a cheerful, thoughtful woman who was always on time. The kind of person whose absence, even for a single day, would immediately feel wrong to the people around her. Susan and Josh had 2 sons. Charlie, born in 2005, Braden, born in 2007. In the family photos that survive, Susan is the woman laughing, a child balanced on her hip, throwing a birthday party, living what looks on the surface like an ordinary life. She is not in any of those photographs a case number. She's a mother standing in her own kitchen, a wife posing for a holiday card, a woman with a good job she was good at, and 2 little boys who needed her. The young family lived near Stephen Powell, Josh's father, in the West Valley City area of Utah. That's not an incidental detail. It will come back later in the story, and it will matter far more than it seems to right now. Here's something very few accounts of this case stop long enough to say. Susan wasn't just a woman who went missing. For years before that happened, she was quietly documenting her own marriage, as if some part of her already knew that one day those pages might be the only thing left to speak for her. She kept a diary at work, not at home. A deliberate choice. Josh could find it. So across those pages written over the years, Susan described a marriage she felt was growing more and more controlling. She never wrote that Josh had threatened her outright in words or any specific act she could point to in court. When a neighbor asked if she was afraid of her husband, Susan said Josh had never made a direct threat. It's just the way he talks, she said. This is one of the hardest parts of the story to sit with, and almost also the most honest one. A feeling of danger doesn't always come with proof clear enough for anyone else to act on. Susan sensed something, a pressure building inside her own home. But she couldn't prove it in a court of law. There was no single phone call to police, no restraining order she could have filed, so she did the one thing still within her power. She wrote it down, again and again, and kept what she'd written somewhere safe. Now that distinction matters more than it might seem. It's easy looking back to ask why no one intervened sooner, but intervening requires something to intervene on. A specific act, a specific threat, a piece of evidence a court or caseworker can point to. What Susan had instead was a feeling, sustained over years, that something was wrong. Feelings like that rarely move a legal system. They move a diary. In June 2008, Susan drew up that will, locked it up in a safe deposit box with the line already mentioned at the top of this video. In her diary, one entry went even further. If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one. Take care of my boys. More than a year before she disappeared, she recorded a short video of herself, alone, in case something happened. Something very few 27-year-olds ever think to do. She told a close co-worker, almost in a whisper, less a complaint than an instruction. If anything ever happens to me, make sure they look at Josh. Now, listen to that sentence out loud and notice what it isn't. It isn't an accusation. It isn't a confession of abuse she could describe in detail. It's an instruction, left with someone who she trusted, for a future she hoped never would arrive. And then, she stayed. That's not a contradiction that needs a tidy explanation. Susan was a woman of deep religious faith, closely tied to her church community. She believed in family, in giving both of her sons a mother and a father. Part of her, according to friends and family who spoke about her later, still hoped she could hold this small family together on her own. She still believed that if she was patient enough, careful enough, things could get better. The growing sense of danger wasn't enough to outweigh that hope. Not enough, at least, to make her leave, take her boys, and start over somewhere else. According to people close to her, that sense of danger didn't stay still. It grew, year over year. There were stretches when part of her wanted nothing more than to grab the boys and leave that night. But just as quickly, faith and hope would pull her back, telling her she could hold on a little longer. Try one more time to mend things. It's a loop anyone who has ever lived inside a relationship full of fear but short on proof will recognize. The feeling is real, but there's no legal language that captures it. This is exactly what sets Susan Powell's story apart from an ordinary criminal mystery. She wasn't a victim who had no idea what was coming. She was a woman who saw it coming, who documented it, who tried to warn people within the limits of a woman in 2008 with no hard evidence could actually do. She kept going to work. She kept raising her sons. She kept showing up for a life that, to everyone around her, looked completely normal. All while quietly building a paper trail she hoped no one would ever need to read. In December 2009, 18 months after Susan locked away that will in a bank, she disappeared. On the afternoon of Sunday, December 6th, a friend stopped by Susan's house in West Valley City and then left. That was the last time anyone outside the Powell household saw Susan Cox Powell alive. The next morning, Josh Powell reported his wife missing. The story he told didn't add up from the start. Josh said he'd taken their 2 sons, then 2 and 4 years old, camping in the middle of the night in falling snow, leaving Susan asleep at home alone. Now, no one in Susan's family or circle of friends had ever heard her mention a camping trip planned for that week. Susan's purse and ID were still in the house, the kind of thing no one leaves behind on purpose. Her phone turned up later inside the minivan Josh had been driving the night before. There was no sign she'd left on her own. No withdrawal, no ticket purchased, no call to a loved one saying she needed time alone. No one has ever seen Susan Cox Powell alive since. For Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan's parents, those first hours were a kind of shock words don't quite reach. Their daughter, who called regularly, who brought the grandkids by to visit, had simply vanished, with no explanation that made any sense. There was no fight to point to, no warning, no phone call, nothing except a story from their son-in-law that got stranger the more they heard it. West Valley City Police opened an investigation, and almost immediately, their suspicions settled on Josh. Investigative records released later showed detectives doubted his camping story from the very first days, and they took note of his behavior in the days after Susan disappeared. Behavior that many described as strange, missing the emotional register you expect from a man who just lost his wife. He didn't organize a search. He didn't go in front of the cameras to plead for information the way most family members of a missing person do. On December 14th, just a week after Susan vanished, Josh hired a criminal defense attorney and skipped his 3rd police interview. The next day, he provided a DNA sample as requested and was formally labeled a person of interest. Someone connected to the case under suspicion, but not a suspect who'd been charged with anything. At the end of January 2010, a police executed a search warrant and seized the blue minivan Josh had driven the night Susan disappeared. And then, everything stalled. This is the point where this story has to be honest with our audience. Instead of rushing towards a more comfortable conclusion, there was a strong suspicion. There was a story that didn't hold together. There was a woman who had written down in her own hand that if anything happened to her, look at her husband. But suspicion, no matter how strong it isn't the same as evidence enough to bring someone to trial at least. Police believed it was likely that Josh Powell was involved in his wife's disappearance. But they didn't have enough to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury. Josh Powell was never charged in connection with Susan's death or disappearance. That needs to be said plainly, not to protect him, because it's the real line between what we know and what we can only believe to be true. Years later, released police records would reveal another detail. Investigators believed it was likely Josh had killed Susan, and that his brother, Michael Powell, may have helped dispose of her body. This remains only a theory held by investigators. Michael Powell was never charged with anything. The 2 brothers are believed to have communicated using a sophisticated computer encryption system that police, to this day, have never been able to break. Whatever was said between them in those messages has stayed locked away as completely as Susan herself. For the Cox family, This was the most unbearable kind of dead end. Not a lack of leads, but too much reasonable suspicion, and not one solid piece of evidence strong enough to turn that suspicion into a trial. Chuck Cox later said he believed letting Josh walk free from that first round of questioning without being detained was a missed opportunity. Though he also acknowledged that under a legal system requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt, police at the time just didn't have the legal grounds to do otherwise. This is one of the most uncomfortable tensions anyone following this case has to sit with. A justice system built to protect the innocent from being wrongly accused, while that same protection sometimes leaves a dangerous gap open for people whose guilt seems certain, but whose evidence isn't there yet. It's tempting, watching from a distance years later, to treat that gap as a failure of any one person. A detective that should have pushed harder, a prosecutor who should have found a way. But the gap here wasn't a failure of effort. It was a limit built into the system. Suspicion, however strong, is not the same thing as proof. In the months that followed, the case drew national media attention. Volunteers organized searches around the West Valley City area. Local police even reached out to police in Minneapolis to compare notes related to the case. None of it led anywhere. For the Cox family, the passing months brought no closure, only a strange, suspended kind of waiting. The case is still open, the suspect's still free, and no new information to hold on to. One door closed, but a question stayed hanging in the air, and somewhere else, a few hundred miles away, another door was about to open, in a way no one saw coming. After Susan disappeared, Josh Powell moved with his two sons to live full-time with his father, Stephen Powell, in the Puyallup area of Washington state. To the public following the case at the time, this looked like a background noise. A grandfather taking his grandsons in while their father was under investigation. It was the kind of arrangement that draws no headlines. Family closing ranks in a crisis, children going somewhere familiar, but there was a detail almost no one knew about at the time, sitting quietly inside Stephen Powell's own private journal. A journal he had no idea police would one day read. 23 hours after Susan disappeared, Stephen Powell wrote in his own journal, "I doubt Susan is alive, and I doubt Josh's hands are clean." 23 hours. Not months, not years. After doubt had time to build on doubt. Less than a full day after his daughter-in-law vanished, her own father-in-law was already writing down a suspicion he would keep to himself for years. This is Josh Powell's own father, the man these two motherless boys were now living with every day, writing almost immediately that he didn't even believe his own son. That he didn't believe he was innocent, and still kept his grandsons living in his house. No one outside the family knew that line existed until it surfaced in the investigative record years later, alongside pages and pages of Stephen Powell's other journal entries, which once made public, revealed a years-long fixation on his own daughter-in-law that predated Susan's disappearance entirely. The search that changed how everyone saw that house started, of all things, with a threat. In 2011, Stephen and Josh publicly threatened to post Susan's teenage diaries online. Diaries they were holding on to as a way of pressuring police and the Cox family. Once again, Susan's own writing, this time from her teenage years, with nothing to do with the marriage that came later, became the center of a turning point in this case. That threat is what brought West Valley City Police in August 2011 to search Stephen Powell's house in Puyallup to seize those diaries. Part of a coordinated set of actions police internally called Operation Tsunami, reportedly aimed at multiple legal fronts involving both Josh and Stephen Powell at once. It was, in other words, an investigation still trying to build pressure on the Powell family through whatever legal doors were still open. years after the original case had gone quiet. What they found in the process had nothing directly to do with Susan's disappearance, but it redrew the entire picture of the house her two sons were growing up in. Police seized dozens of computer disks containing thousands of images and videos, including footage secretly recorded of women and neighborhood girls, some as young as 7 or 8 in bathrooms, while showering, none of them being aware they were being filmed with a telephoto lens from inside that same house. Stephen Powell was charged with 14 counts of voyeurism and 1 count of possessing child pornography. A jury later found Stephen Powell guilty on all 14 counts of voyeurism. He was sentenced to 2.5 years of prison. The child pornography charge was initially dismissed by a judge who ruled the images didn't meet the legal definition of sexually explicit conduct, but an appeals court later overturned that ruling, and Stephen Powell was formally convicted on the child pornography charge as well. This is where the story needs to slow down for a moment, not for shock value, but so the audience can actually feel what's being pieced together here. For years before she disappeared, Susan Powell had written about a vague, hard-to-name fear she couldn't prove in any court. She had no idea. There's no evidence she ever knew what was actually happening inside the house where her husband grew up, where her sons now slept every night, and where her own image throughout those teenage diaries had also become something used as a leverage. A mother's fear, it turns out, had been right all along, in a way she never had enough information to imagine. She trusted her instincts enough to write them down. She never got the chance to find out just how much they deserved to be trusted. Stephen Powell's arrest changed everything. Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan's parents, had been fighting for custody of their 2 grandsons since the day their daughter disappeared. For the 2 years before that, they could only see the boys on court-approved visits, while Charlie and Braden lived with their father and grandfather, an arrangement at the time no one in the system had enough legal grounds to change, despite the suspicion surrounding Josh from the very beginning. After Stephen Powell's arrest, everything shifted fast. The court ordered Josh to remove the boys from that house immediately. A judge granted temporary custody of Charlie and Braden to their grandparents. The custody order didn't undo anything that had already happened. It didn't explain where Susan was, but it moved 2 children out of a house where it would later turn out their own grandfather harbored doubts about their father that he never shared with anyone who could have acted on them. For Chuck and Judy, this was a small, slow, incomplete kind of justice. They still didn't know where their daughter was, but at least the boys were now somewhere they believed was safer. In the months that followed, the Cox family tried to rebuild something resembling a normal life for the 2 boys, getting them to school, to church, trying to shield them from the full weight of what the family was going through. All while Chuck and Judy themselves still didn't know where their daughter was every single day, even as they raised 2 grandsons who just lost their mother. There was no manual for this. No one teaches grandparents how to become full-time parents again in the middle of a missing persons investigation, while grieving a daughter they couldn't yet let themselves fully grieve, because part of them still held out hope she might be found. At the same time, they had to learn something no grandparent ever wants to learn: how to pursue a complicated custody case through hearing after hearing, while still making sure Charlie and Braden felt loved and safe at home every night. Their attorney had to constantly balance presenting the full extent of the danger they believed Josh posed against the limits of what a court could actually consider, given that he'd never been convicted of anything. Josh Powell didn't give up. He kept pursuing custody through the courts, well within the rights of a father who had never been convicted of any criminal charge connected to Susan or his sons. Legally, he was still Charlie and Braden's father, with every right to have custody reconsidered, regardless of how much suspicion police and his in-laws held against him. On February 1st, 2012, at a custody hearing, a judge issued a declaration that would prove to be a turning point, denying Josh's request to regain custody and ordering him to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, a formal clinic assessment ordered by the court. It was meant to determine whether he posed a risk to his own children before the court would consider any future requests from him. For the Cox family, this felt like a win, a sign that the system was finally starting to see what they'd felt for 2 years. After years of feeling like they were shouting into an empty room, this was the first time a judge had formally agreed that something about Josh Powell needed a closer look before he could be alone with his sons again. No one in the Cox family knew that within days, this small victory would become part of the explanation for the worst thing they would ever have to face. That's the cruel logic at the center of this story. The very step forward the legal system took, forcing a dangerous father into tighter oversight, is what police would later believe pushed Josh Powell towards his final decision. For a few days, the Cox family let themselves believe the worst might be behind them. 4 days later, everything came apart. On the afternoon of February 5th, 2012, a caseworker brought Charlie, then 7, and Braden, then 5, to Josh Powell's rented house in Graham, Washington, for a supervised visit. A visit arranged by the legal system itself, meant to protect the boys following the standard supervised visitation procedure the court had approved. Now, here's the paradox that this story forces its audience to sit with. Supervised visitation exists to protect children in cases where a parent is considered dangerous, but it's designed to guard against risks that can be observed during the visit itself, like physical violence in front of the supervising caseworker. It isn't designed for a scenario where the moment the door closes, the parent is prepared to destroy the entire house with himself inside it. Josh opened the door, quickly pulled the boys inside, and locked it in the caseworker's face. She tried to follow them in. He wouldn't let her. There was no time left after that for anyone outside the door to stop what came next. Seconds later, the house exploded. The investigation that followed showed that this wasn't a moment of impulse, it was a plan. In the days before, Josh had packed up the boys' books and toys and given them away to charity, as if he already knew they wouldn't need them anymore. He'd brought multiple cans of gasoline into the house. He'd set aside a hatchet. According to investigators, Charlie and Braden were wounded with a sharp object before the house went up in flames, fed by a large amount of gasoline Josh had prepared. All 3 people inside the house, Josh, Charlie, and Braden, died. There is no version of this moment that needs embellishing. The facts, stated plainly, carry all the weight this story needs. The caseworker standing outside that door had done exactly what her job required: bring the children, supervise the visit, and step in if anything seemed wrong. No standard supervised visitation procedure anywhere is built to anticipate a father willing to lock the door and burn the house down with his own children inside. That's the limit of the entire system. Not any one person failed to get past in time. Police believe Josh had been planning this since he lost the custody hearing 4 days earlier. That the ruling required his psychosexual evaluation, the very thing the Cox family had seen as a win, is what pushed him towards his final decision. Chuck Cox later told reporters something he would carry for the rest of his life: that his own family had warned the authorities more than once that Josh was capable of hurting his own children if he was ever backed into a corner. And that warning, like the one Susan had written years earlier, turned out to be true, but too late to stop what happened. There's a silence that needs to be held here, not filled in with any further explanation, This is the point where the warning Susan wrote years earlier, "If anything ever happens to me," expanded in a way she could never have imagined. Not just her, but her 2 sons as well, ultimately went unprotected by that warning or by any warning from the people who loved him in the time. Josh Powell died that same day. There will be no trial for anything he was ever suspected of. The question of what happened to Susan, a question only he and possibly one other living person knew the answer to, now had only half a chance of ever being answered. His brother, Michael Powell, the one investigators had suspected of helping dispose of Susan's body, though he was never charged, took his own life a year later in 2013, closing off all that remained for that chance. News of the explosion spread across the country within hours. For people who'd followed the case since 2009, this was the kind of news that makes you sit down. Not a new twist in a missing persons case, but a confirmation, in blood, of exactly what the Cox family and many observers had feared for 2 years. That the man suspected of causing the first tragedy was fully capable of causing a second, if nothing stopped him. Reporters who had covered the case since Susan's disappearance found themselves writing the same warning they'd written before, except this time, there was no one left to warn. In a way, the Powell family had closed off any chance of ever getting a full answer to the central question of this entire case. What really happened to Susan? The 2 people investigators most suspected of knowing were now both gone. After the death of their grandsons, Chuck and Judy Cox did the only thing still within their power. They sued. Grief in most families is private. For the Coxes, grief became a matter of public record. Depositions, expert witnesses, years of litigation. All of it conducted in the full view of a case the country had already been watching for years. They sued the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, the agency that had arranged that supervised visit, alleging negligence in assessing and preventing the risk Josh Powell posed to his own children. The core argument of the lawsuit wasn't that the agency knew nothing. It was that they had enough information to recognize the risk, but their evaluation and oversight process still wasn't rigorous enough to prevent the worst possible outcome. In 2018, a jury reached a verdict. The state of Washington was liable, with damages set at $98.5 million, one of the largest civil liability verdicts ever recorded in a case involving the Child Protective Services system in the United States. The trial judge later reduced that amount. The Cox family appealed. The Washington Court of Appeals in a later ruling restored nearly the entire original award. The number itself made headlines. What got less attention was what the number actually represented. A jury, hearing all of the evidence. The number itself made headlines. What got less attention was what the number actually represented. A jury, hearing all of the evidence, concluding that this outcome had been foreseeable and preventable. This was a form of justice, but one that never answered the question this family had lived with for over a decade. Money didn't tell them where Susan was. Money didn't bring back Charlie or Braden. Money only confirmed in the one language a civil court can use that yes, there had been negligence. And yes, that negligence may have contributed to the deaths of 2 children. It's worth naming what that verdict could and couldn't do. It could hold an agency financially accountable. It could not hold anyone criminally responsible for Susan's disappearance, because no one still living had ever been charged with it. The legal process dragged on for years, through multiple rounds of appeal, with the damages adjusted up and down more than once before reaching somewhere close to a final figure. For Chuck and Judy, every round of appeal meant telling their family's story to a court all over again, to prove, once more, something they'd already known for a long time. that there had been enough warning signs and enough time to act on them. But the system hadn't moved enough, or fast enough, or tidily enough. As for Stephen Powell, he served his sentence for voyeurism and child pornography, then was released after completing his term. He was never charged with anything directly connected to Susan's disappearance. There's a painful asymmetry sitting at the center of this part of the story. The legal system was, in the end, able to hold someone, the state of Washington, accountable in dollars for a failure that could be proven, with documents, with procedures, with paper trails. But for the biggest question of all, the one Susan tried to leave a warning about back in 2008, that same system never had enough evidence to offer any official answer. Some losses the law can put a price on, and some it never reaches at all. Chuck and Judy Cox now had a number attached to what the state owed them. They still didn't have their daughter. Susan Powell's body has never been found. That single fact sits underneath everything else in this story. Every hearing, every headline, every year that passed, none of it changed the one thing this entire case still doesn't have: a place to lay her to rest. In the years after she disappeared, Chuck Cox once led a search along 400 miles of interstate highway, from Oregon to northern Utah, with dozens of volunteers. One of many efforts the family organized on its own, outside the scope of the official investigation, hoping to find some small clue the police might have missed. It is the kind of search most families never have to learn how to organize. Routes planned, volunteers briefed, ground covered on foot, mile after mile for a woman who might not be anywhere along that road at all. In 2022, acting on a new tip, a search team spent 8 days digging through abandoned mine shafts in Utah's West Desert. They found bones and scraps of fabric, including a pair of pants whose style and size could have matched the woman's clothing. For a moment, there was a real hope, the kind the Cox family had learned painfully not to let themselves feel too often. Chuck Cox told reporters at the time that he felt fairly confident it would turn out to be his daughter. DNA testing later confirmed those bone fragments weren't human. As the most recent public information available, Utah investigators described the Susan Powell case as open, but stalled. There's no longer an active team pursuing the case day to day the way there was in the early years, but the tip line is still open. Investigators continue to cross-check forensic genetic genealogy against unidentified remains found in the region, hoping that one day, one of them will turn out to be her. Every so often, remains found somewhere else, once an entire state away, spark a brief flicker of hope, before testing confirms it isn't Susan. That pattern, hope, then confirmation, then disappointment, has repeated itself enough times now that it has become its own kind of grief, distinct from the grief of losing someone all at once. Chuck and Judy Cox, after losing their daughter and then both of their grandsons, started a non-profit foundation named after her, the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, with a mission to provide free media and resource support to other families searching for missing loved ones, and to contribute to domestic violence prevention. It's a way of turning their own grief into something useful for other families facing the same nightmare. A way of continuing to speak now that their own daughter's voice can no longer be heard. They still live with this unanswered question every day, more than 15 years after the night Susan disappeared. Still hoping, as they've said before, that an answer will come one day, even as they've learned to live without any certainty that it ever will. That too is a kind of endurance rarely captured in a headline, choosing to keep hoping without ever being promised it will be rewarded. In June 2008, Susan Cox wrote a single line, locked it in a safe deposit box, and went on living with her life. Going to work, raising 2 sons, trying to hold her family together, all while carrying a premonition she couldn't prove, and so no one else could act on it alongside her. All except Josh Powell. I don't trust him. More than 15 years later, no one can ask Susan Powell what she knew, or when she knew it. No one can ask Charlie or Braden what they felt inside their grandfather's house in the final afternoon of their short lives. What remains are the words Susan left behind, not as evidence in a police file, but as the only voice she has left, written down before anyone else, even the people who loved her the most, could listen closely enough, in time, to act. A diary kept in a drawer at work, a will locked in a bank, a whispered instruction to a coworker, none of it loud, all of it true. She was right, not once, but twice, about her husband and about what he was capable of when he had nothing left to lose. The question this case leaves behind isn't only where Susan Powell is, though that's still the question Chuck and Judy Cox live with every day. It's also a question about the distance between someone writing down a warning and the world around them hearing it before it's too late. It's a question that doesn't end with this case. It's worth carrying into every story like it that comes after. Susan Powell believed that if something happened to her, the words she left behind would speak for her. She was right about that much, at least. More than 15 years later, those words, not a trial, not a confession, not a body ever found, remain the closest thing to the truth that anyone outside her family has ever had.